Now it's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Russia seems to be intensifying its shelling of Ukraine 7 weeks into its invasion, which began in late February. Under relentless bombardment by Russian forces, the southern port city of Mariupol is refusing to surrender, and a series of attacks in Ukraine's western city and as the second largest city, Kharkiv, has left at least a dozen people dead. A major ground offensive in Ukraine's eastern region is expected, along with continued strikes targeting weapons and logistics centres. While diplomacy is still at a standstill, the cost of war is mounting and the impact of sanctions is leaving all sides reeling. We discussed the latest developments with Raphael Cohen, Director of the Strategy and Doctrine Programme of RAND Project Air Force, and Christopher A. Hartwell, Professor at CHAW School of Management and Law. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. And, well, first of all, Dr. Cohen, my first question to you. Now, Russia has been scaling up its attacks on Ukrainian cities after issuing a surrender or die ultimatum to forces in Mariupol on Sunday. And now Ukrainian soldiers continue to defy this, and they've been defending their city. But can they really keep it up, though? If it falls, then how would it affect the overall direction of the war?
Sure. So first off, thank you so much for having me. I think there are three major consequences if Mariupol falls. First, on a sort of tactical level, it will free up Russian forces that were engaged in the capture of Mariupol for operations further east, or further west, I should say, into the Donbas. So it will tip some of the conventional forces balance. The second, on I think a more strategic level, though, is a lesson that Russia will take away from the fall of Mariupol, which is basically that brutality works. And the way that you take back Ukraine is by leveling it. And that's a very dangerous precedent to set. And then the third, I think, implication for this is more for Ukraine, is that no one, or at least no Western observer that I know of prior to the conflict, would have thought that Mariupol would have held on for as long as it has. And I think this is going to feed into the Ukrainian narrative that defense and the ability of Ukraine to defend its country is far stronger than any outside observer will thought prior to the conflict, will only strengthen the resolve going forward.
And Dr. Cohen, now the US has been preparing an $800 million military package for Ukraine, which includes 500 more Javelin anti-tank missiles, 300 Switchblade drones, and for the first time it's going to provide howitzer cannons and also 40,000 artillery rounds to Ukraine. So what difference will these make?
Sure. So two major implications. So first, on the tactical level, the reason why you want howitzers in particular is the nature of the conflict in the Donbas. The Donbas, unlike the battle for Kyiv, which you saw play out a few weeks ago, this is open terrain. This privileges maneuver, it privileges firepower. And that firepower is going to be provided by those howitzers that we're providing among other allies. Then I think on a more strategic level, I think this is actually more of a continuation of the same basic strategy that the United States and its allies are employing vis-a-vis Russia, which is we are going to try to coerce Russia into ending its conflict by two means. One is a sanctions line of effort, and the other one is military aid to Ukraine. The idea is that both of those will inflict enough cost on Russia such that it will stop its offensive and hopefully lead to some sort of settlement.
Professor Hartwell, now, in order to raise the costs for Russia in continuing this war, Western allies are looking into expanding their sanctions options, and the EU earlier this month banned Russian coal for the first time in the fifth package of sanctions imposed in April. Now, oil is set to become a part of a sixth package that's likely to be imposed. What will the sixth package look like, and what impact is it going to have on the Russian economy?
Well, it's sad that it's taken so long to get to this point, that we kind of keep ratcheting up the sanctions while, as Dr. Cohen said, there is just this approach by the Russians to kind of level Ukraine. You know, the reasons have changed back and forth: denazification, demilitarization. Ukraine as the state shouldn't exist. So we've had this very, very slow burn in terms of increasing sanctions. In reality, the only pain that is going to come to Russia is going to come from one of two areas. The first one was already done and was a surprise to me, and I think to a lot of observers, that was freezing the assets of the Russian central bank. Brilliant move, making it so that Russia cannot service its debts, it cannot remain integrated in supply chains, it cannot pay for what it needs in order to feed the war machine. The second bit of sanctions that it needs to be able to inflict real damage is oil and gas. I mean, Europe is still, again, feeding the Russian war machine by purchasing Russian oil and gas. Germany has been very reluctant. Hungary has been outright against this. If we can have some kind of sanctions package that actually includes shutting off from Russian oil and gas, then you will start to see things really start to bite.
But Professor Hartwell, now inflation has been skyrocketing in Europe amid this war and the EU sanctions against Russia, of course. And a recent report by Eurostat in April showed that overall inflation in the Eurozone is up to 7.5%, and that's marking a record high. And well, energy costs alone, they jumped 44% from last year, and food prices around 5%. Now, how is this all affecting daily life in Europe? And do you expect inflation to continue on the up?
Well, we've got two things that are going on here, really three things. The first is that we've been in quantitative easing, unconventional monetary policy for at least 12 years, if not 14 years. And central banks have kept interest rates low. We've had asset buybacks. We've just had tons of liquidity pumped into the system, and it hasn't made kind of Western economies, especially the European Union, it has not made them any more resilient. It's made them much more fragile. Second, we have the self-inflicted economic wound of COVID-19 lockdowns, prohibitions on economic activity. Right now, as we're starting to come out of that, what we see is all of this pent-up demand that is encountering all of this liquidity, and that's encountering supply chain disruptions. So just like in the basic Econ 1 definition, we have too much money chasing too few goods. On top of that, now we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is further disrupting supply chains, creating even more of these kind of disruptions, as well as increasing the costs of energy. It's probably also going to bite when it comes to food, because Russia and Ukraine are such large producers of wheat and corn. I think this is going to create problems going forward. So there really is no end to kind of where we can go with inflation, given this perfect storm of economic conditions. However, the longer the war goes on, the longer we have these kind of disruptions to supply chains, the more we'll see the kind of impact on energy in particular, especially if the EU kind of goes ahead with these sanctions. It's something that we should be willing to bear, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that there is going to be an increase in energy prices.
Well, for now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been insisting that these sanctions haven't been very effective. But, well, he does seem a bit more concerned about the military aid going towards Ukraine. And Dr. Cohen, now, President Putin has told NATO to stop sending military aid to Ukraine, and he's warned of what he called unpredictable consequences. What might these pertain to?
Sure. So Putin has a variety of escalatory measures at his disposal, some of which he saw play out over the last 24 hours, which is this expansion of strikes in previously safe areas like Lvov out in western Ukraine. You could think of it ratcheting it one step up, trying to interdict weapon shipments as they cross over the border from NATO countries into Ukraine as well, perhaps targeting some of Western individuals inside Ukraine as well. But ultimately, the big card that Putin has is his nuclear weapons card. And he's made a variety of sort of more explicit and less explicit references to using it. And I think that's the one that Western policymakers really need to be concerned about.
And Dr. Cohen, now what's very concerning is that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, he warned that the world needs to prepare for the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons. Now, how should the world then actually prepare for this scenario?
Sure. So, I mean, it's not just President Zelensky who's warned about this. The director of the CIA has warned about it. This is actually, most Russian experts have said that, Putin is ruthless enough that he would use tactical nuclear weapons. And to be clear, a tactical nuclear weapon is still several times the size of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, for that matter. So these are not small weapons. These are not precise. These would be very brutal. Now, how we prepare for it, I think, is sort of twofold. On a very sort of tactical level, you could talk about surviving in a nuclear environment. That means a variety of protective gear and so forth, treating casualties from radiation, which we know was actually one of the major sources of damage and casualties from a nuclear blast. But I think on a more profound strategic level, though, the United States, NATO, and frankly, the rest of the globe, and particularly global democracies, need to think about how they will respond to the first nuclear use since the end of World War II. And do we really want to live in a world where authoritarian despots can change the map of the globe based on the use of nuclear weapons? I mean, South Korea, of all countries, should realize the concern here. So that's, I think, something that capitals around the world need to begin wrestling with, and need to begin wrestling with sooner rather than later.
And Professor Hartwell, how do you see this? I mean, there's growing nervousness in Europe. How should the continent then really prepare for a possible nuclear scenario?
Well, I agree with everything Dr. Cohen says. It's either you prepare for it now or you prepare for it later. If you let Putin kind of redraw the map of Europe on a whim, that means all he needs to do is threaten. He needs to threaten that there's going to be nuclear war, and then he gets what he wants. He expands to the borders of NATO. And it's salami tactics then. He just keeps slicing a little bit, a little bit, a little bit more. At what point do you actually put your foot down and say, no, this is a NATO country. No, this is out of bounds. How can you actually prepare for that? And the problem, again, I'm an economist, I'm not a political scientist. The issue that comes is that this introduces just a huge amount of uncertainty into the markets. It introduces a huge amount of uncertainty into planning going forward, and it depresses economic activity. Not as much as a nuclear warhead would do, though. I would say that would probably depress economic activity the most. But in general, there has to be a line drawn somewhere. And again, looking at this from an economic standpoint, is that you have to increase the costs. You have to make it so that Vladimir Putin knows that there will be massive consequences to any use of a nuke. In fact, even if it is a tactical nuke, again, Dr. Cohen said kind of the size, the payload that comes with these, we have to ratchet it up so that he cannot even begin to fathom what would happen if he used something like that.
And Professor Hartwell, you mentioned the economic perspective. And well, how should European countries then really diversify their energy sources and safeguard their economies?
Well, the diversification, unfortunately, is long delayed. It's now kind of picking up speed in earnest. We saw Poland, we saw Lithuania doing it after 2014, kind of building the liquefied natural gas terminals to be able to receive shipments from the United States. They have to be looking elsewhere. We have to be looking to the south, to the Gulf countries. We have to be looking back to the United States. The United States needs to be back where it was a few years ago in terms of leading the world in oil and gas production. We need to, domestically, the United States needs to kind of get out of the way when it comes to the regulatory strictures that are on improving the oil and gas industry. And we also have to start being serious about moving away from fossil fuels. The fact that so many authoritarian countries have this ready source of funding, should be troubling as an international relations expert kind of going forward. You can look at the world and say, why do all the despots have all of the money? So we need to think about moving away from that as well. But that's a longer term plan. For the time being, we need to provide competition and we need to turn off the spigot.
Dr. Cohen, finally, with President Putin declaring peace talks pretty much ineffective and diplomatic expulsion taking place on each side, is the diplomatic option effectively dead?
Well, look, I'll say this as an optimist. There will be a diplomatic settlement to this conflict eventually. And the reason for that is Putin has shown he can't take Kyiv, and we're not going to go march to Moscow. So between the two of that, that means there's going to be some sort of settlement eventually. Now, whether or not that means that the two sides actually sit down and sign a formal peace treaty, or whether there's some sort of tacit ceasefire agreement, I think we don't really know that. But what we can say with Putin's statements and Putin, more importantly, Putin's actions, is that that diplomatic settlement is not going to be coming in the short run. And I think because of that, we need to frankly focus on the military means and make sure that the Ukrainians have everything they can have to succeed on the battlefield.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen at RAND Corporation and Professor Hartwell at the CHAW School of Management and Law.
Thanks so much for having us.